So that's the original South America notion. This notion instead is really thinking about Wisconsin Rapids, and if you know anything about us, there are a lot of folks who still struggle with the sale of CPI in the mid-90s. We still struggle with self-identity a bit as a result. We still tend to have a bit of a negative image, unfortunately, about the community. And the notion here was that this was really a positive psychology kind of moment, I guess, where we wanted kids to first create the map, take ownership in the map, and then once they had a map that they created with these balloon kits, rather than identify house numbers like the South America project, it was their job to go and identify what do we value in our community. So a really positive spin to try and suggest to adults that there are some very real things that we can value as a community and that can help bring us together. And so once that map got built, if I remember the end of the process correctly, that map went on display at local Wisconsin Raptors baseball games, so that as folks were coming in, they could sort of see from a child's perspective what's valuable about the community that we live in. So still involved technology, but I hope with the last couple of examples it's even clearer than with the web projects, which look very much about technology, and they are, that technology kind of takes a back seat to the need and the problem that we're trying to figure out how to address in the community. And we're also trying to find ways, you'll see lots of different faces and lots of different ages of folks that are involved in this project. So we're now not just talking about something that we're doing for the community, we're talking about things that we can do to enable the community, and technology happens to be a piece of that. And so when I think about projects that I think back most fondly on, it tends to be those projects because of that enabling moment that gets attached to it. You know what, in the spirit of time, I'm going to mostly skip this, other than to say that if you're interested in working with any of us on campus, we have some great folks in James Sage from philosophy. I mentioned Gina earlier. Some of my resources. We've thought a lot about how do these projects work and what do we have to do to support them. So there are a lot of web-based resources that are available to help with this. For my students, I've developed 140 pages of documentation to kind of walk through, how do you really work with a community partner and succeed along the way. What are some of the issues you're going to deal with? How are we going to resolve those types of things? So very well supported in that respect. And it's where I'm especially fortunate that my department and my department chair especially values this work, because it took an entire summer to get everything ultimately put together into that kind of format. And so for that to be valued at the end of the year is something that I needed to do was quite helpful. For this to work, I think it's really important for the students involved, for me, to reflect on the experience and to reflect on it at the beginning, the middle, and end of the project. And there are lots of ways to do that reflection. Sometimes we talk about it, sometimes we journal about it. That can vary, and I'm not that terribly concerned about it. But what often gets missed and isn't very adequately captured here is, I think the best reflection also involves our community partners as well, so that they're part of not just that celebration, but that critical reflection of, what worked well, what could we do differently if we were to approach this again, to try and get to some constant improvement with the projects that we're working on. And part of it's just logistics. Sometimes it's hard, we're all busy, it's tough to take that time to reflect and celebrate, and it's easy to overlook, I think, in those respects. My colleague in the back can attest to the challenge of tolerating failure, because we're tolerating it as I speak. We have a group that we're struggling with at this very moment, and that happens. The challenge that I think we have is that oftentimes, at least for me, and so this may be a personal failing, We expect things to be right the first time. We tend to reward the students who get it right the first time the most. But the truth of the matter is, if everyone did what we asked them to do well the first time, well, what do they need us for? But I think it's easy sometimes to fall into that trap. And so what we talk about in class is being willing to tolerate failure. So if something doesn't go right on your project, you don't try and hide it from your professor or from your group. You bring it out in class, you talk about it, you brainstorm together, and you support each other in trying to find the solutions for doing that. So that ultimately what we're really striving for in talking about all of those little failures is how do we use each little failure to get one step closer to success? Because the failures are going to happen and they're inevitable. Success is a little bit more elusive, but for most groups also where we ultimately end up. Where we sometimes have challenges in that process of, so what does success look like and how do we get there? We do constantly have to remind ourselves in the classroom about our own motivations. Sometimes that's a grade, sometimes that's a letter of recommendation. In the best of worlds, it's having that commitment and investment to the project and the community partner. Without that, the other stuff is really kind of difficult. While we're reminding ourselves of that, we're also reminding our partner organizations that they too need to strive for success. They too need to remember that the students are going to go away, and so smiling and nodding throughout the project when it's not going well isn't going to do you any favors. And it's tough, right? Because you're not paying money for it. But to me, what's a little ironic in that situation is you are paying something that's much more valuable to the process, and that's your time and it's your expertise. That time and expertise is something that you can contribute to those students in a way that, as an instructor, I can't in exactly and precisely the same way. So when things don't go well, we really encourage our clients to speak up and to help us find solutions where that's appropriate. I'll wrap up in just a couple minutes so that we have time for questions. Apologies for going a little bit over. What I should really say here is that with these kinds of projects, we're all of us difficult in different ways. I'm difficult with these guys. They're difficult in some respects. This is a different kind of teaching. I find it to be a more difficult, exhausting kind of teaching, and I think it comes from some of the emotional investment that ends up being almost inevitable in good projects. And I point that out because I think it's important to reflect and to think back on the experience, because usually at the end of the semester, if you catch me on Friday, and my wife jokes about this, I'll come home and I'm like, I'm exhausted, I'm never doing 480 again, I'm done, I'm tired, I'm going to bed and I'm not doing anything. And I take my little 2-hour nap and I go back to work. And that's usually about all it takes. We're all a little bit different in terms of what it takes to kind of reflect and renew and sort of get back to it. But I think about these kinds of comments from students, and I like to think I don't live in that ivory tower, that I do live in the real world, and that perhaps these projects are one way that I do that. But when I hear these types of comments from students, this really truly is what renews me and encourages me the next semester around to come back to this particular approach again and to do it again. There's another way to look at it, and I originally thought I was, Chris introduced me as having a degree in accounting, and so we can talk later about how I ended up in a computing and media technologies department, but my inner accountant comes out sometimes, and so I just naturally thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I should quantify it. And some folks on campus were already kind of had an approach to do that, so I just took their template and started thinking about my projects and kind of diligently every semester plugged my numbers in and walked away from it. And it really wasn't until the end of last semester that in the hours column saw that we had passed the 25,000 hour mark. I don't know about you guys, but I don't even know what 25,000 is. It's really difficult for me to conceptualize that and think about that number of hours and the effort that has gone into projects. But that's 250 students roughly who have had the opportunity to work with partners in the community and have that experience over that amount of time. And it was also, with great humility, also a way to reflect back on the experiences and the good fortune that I've had on campus to do this kind of work with students. So again, like I said, kind of a nice way to sort of reflect on the experience and think about sort of the impact that students have been able to have as a result. So just 2 more slides. In terms of getting started, I think the best way to start, whichever side of the relationship you're on, if your first project can be a small project, a 10-hour project, and if it can be with someone you already have a relationship with, so that when things go wrong, you're not afraid to pick up the phone or to send an email, that can be ideal. But if you don't know who to start with, I don't think that should necessarily be a hindrance. It's more of a, ideally, if you can start this way, I think that's useful. Think about what the project's going to be. Think about what your biggest needs happen to be. Oftentimes that's a great place to start because it's especially rewarding to be able to wrap up that kind of project and then to start to think about the next project and relationship. And more than anything, and I say this to colleagues on campus, there's a lot going on in these projects. There's a lot to managing them. A lot of it you can figure out as you go, and so don't let fear of the unknown stop you. Jump in and get started. And any mistake that I've ever made in one of these projects, and I've made a ton of them, are almost always something that you can address and fix. So the last slide is an easy one. If you're interested, and I very much did not intend this to be Tim going out and hoping to get projects, because quite honestly, fall's almost full already as it is. I really meant this to be a sharing of some really good work that my colleagues have done on campus and that my students have done on campus. But that being said, if you want to talk about community projects, community service learning, I'm always available, and as you can tell, always really excited to talk to like-minded folks about this kind of work in the community. So I apologize, I'm a little bit over 45 minutes, but would be happy to take any questions or any comments that you might have. Yes, sir.
So I seem to recall, I think in the write-up of this, talking about social networking. So, and for those of us who have been around a while, this concept of Facebook and it's beyond us all. Yet obviously reading is an important way to get your message out. So can you say a little bit about how your projects might have used sort of popular social networking and how you trained those of us who are sort of struggling to understand what it's really all about?
Sure, and to do that, a little bit of a story. I don't want to push anyone's political hot buttons, but I have to mention Newt Gingrich in this particular story. In 2007, I guess his wife's family is from the area, and so they were back for Christmas and decided to take a tour of the Point Brewery. And so I guess if you're Newt, the marketing person doesn't give you the tour, the president gives you the tour. And so Newt's asking Joe how things are going at the brewery, and Joe says, we're struggling a little bit. We know that part of it is that we need a better web presence, we need to figure out social media, but we don't have that kind of money to invest. And so I don't know what to do. And Newt said to him, apparently, at least this is the way the story was told to me, well, you've got a college campus in your backyard, call them. The students will figure it out. So a couple weeks later, I get a call from the marketing manager who says, this might seem a little weird and I can explain later, but can you help us? And as it turned out, I was teaching a summer course on online marketing and e-commerce. We wanted to do some social media work, and I was really worried about students showing up to class on really sunny 80-degree days. So on the first day I said, guess what guys, we're going to talk about beer for 13 days. It's amazing what you can get a college student to sit through if every once in a while you say, so how does this relate to the brewery? We developed a business plan for them, we did a bunch of work for them, but I think the most dramatic was working with them on developing a social media strategy. And for them, it was predominantly a combination of Twitter and Facebook. And what the students were able to figure out when we started the project, They had about 150 fans on Facebook. And I wish Brett Widman, who was out in the hallway earlier for another meeting, would have been able to stick around because he was largely responsible for this. He figured out how to take that 150 member number and drive it up to 15,000. And I really believe that in terms of some of the success that the breweries had in recent years, at least some small piece has been a factor of the buzz that they're creating, no pun intended, with their social media strategies and especially what it does to drive some of the traffic to things like the 5-mile run that they sponsor in the spring and some of the other events that they've been really generous with their time and their money in the community. Another student last semester has been working with Michael Zell locally, who's a family law lawyer. He's fairly new to town from Milwaukee. He was struggling to build business here, and he acknowledged that some of it was, you know, as a lawyer and a very established kind of community, it's going to take me a while to break in, but is there anything that I can do with social media that might be able to help? We have a student who spends somewhere between 5 and 10 hours a week with Mike to make sure that his content is well written, that Google is indexing it correctly, that he or she on her behalf is tweeting on a regular basis with legal advice so that when folks think family law here in Stevens Point, and if you look, Mike comes up top of the list very, very consistently and with a very small amount of time and effort. With those two examples, we haven't done a whole lot more out in the community with social media. Some little pieces with Portage County Humane Society come to mind, but it's been a little challenging because with social media, as an organization, you have to make a commitment to it, to do it on a regular basis, and that's usually the stumbling block, quite frankly, is we can get it set up, but then we can't necessarily sustain it. And so at that point, you know, we try and have good discussions with folks about whether or not social media should be part of the mix for them. Chris?
Just calling in your accounting background a little bit, we're often asked to quantify our impact on the region economically. And so I'm interested in that column that you had under impact. Where'd you get those numbers and how did you calculate the impact column?
I will have to go back to get the exact name of the organization, but there is a website that pays very careful attention to volunteer impact in the local community, and through their research on an annual basis, they set some kind of hourly rate and attach it to that value, and they do it at the statewide level. So I would describe that as a good ballpark number, I think.
Because I assume that would be included in the number that we're often given about how much our university is worth to the community. And I think that's in there, but I would wonder if it is, and if it's not, it should be.
If it's not, I agree, it should be. I think it rolls up through our Center for Academic Excellence and Student Engagement. Yeah.
I'm currently a student in Human and Community Resources doing a project-based learning with a local health-based coalition. And I'm interested to know about that critical reflection part. Do you have something specific that your students have to do for that? Or is it what works for them? Or how is that approached?
I have some questions that I use to structure it. I'm interested in starting with just a base description of, so, you know, what did you do, and in very general terms. And so this is up to the person talking or writing.